I think God has put a lot in place to make us ready to be in full relationship with Him, and that's been His plan the entire time. And so a part of that is we have capabilities for healing that are built into us that are part of His own image that are built in. So when I'm doing therapy with somebody, I am not healing them.
Uh,
That's a kind of, it's almost idolatry of self in my mind to say that. I am not the healer. I am somebody who is connecting them with something that pre-existed in wherever it lives in their body, in their nervous system, in their brain, to just kickstart that thing. And maybe you might call it like a antivirus software, or you might call it like a little engine or machine whose job is to heal. I didn't build that. And I'm just participating in this plan that God has to restore everything to full relationship with Himself, which means, no suffering, no illness, no disorder.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Jonathan Cogburn, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist. We connected on X, and I think we see a lot of the same things that we're noticing going on in our field. So I'm happy to have you here. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Man, I'm excited to have just a nice dialogue about things that we often interact over.
Yeah, definitely. So just start out. Tell me, where you're from, what's your background, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I am from Texas. I live in the Abilene area, which is mid-sized town, I'd say. It's about 100,000 people. I came here back in 2004, and in order to go to school, there's Abilene Christian University here. And my plan originally in life was to get involved in some kind of ministry training, like doing probably campus ministry or family ministry. And my family, the only members of my family that had graduated from college, graduated from Abilene Christian, and Abilene Christian is the only, or it was for a long time, the only university, maybe in the country, but for sure in the state, that had a bachelor's level ministry track. Most of the time you got to go to seminary, but they have a degree plan called Youth and Family Ministry Bachelor of Arts here. And so I got kind of drawn into leadership in church and was like, okay, that's where I want to go. Then in kind of towards the end of the bachelor's training I was doing for that program, I was in a pastoral counseling class, and the professor was an LPC and he was an elder at one of the churches here in town. And they had like a really bad tragedy that occurred during that semester, when an auto accident, and there was fatality, and it was a child. And the professor knew that family really, really well. They were from his church. And I was sitting in his class and I was watching him think through out loud how he was going to approach the family and things he had already done with the family. And I remember him just exuding this calm, like I'm calm, methodical, peaceful. I could tell the way he was talking about it in the class was the way he was with the family for whatever reason. And I was thinking, man, I would have no idea how to do that. And then the reality hit me, like if I was going to go work in a church, I've got to be able to deal with tragedy and loss. And I had no mechanism for that in my head. And so I started looking around, and right upstairs in the same building is the Marriage and Family Institute. It is a really, really great master's program in marriage and family therapy. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Did not, I was thinking, oh, I can do marriage counseling as a minister. That'll help me do that. But it was something that really, really powerfully changed the way that I viewed the world and gave me like some confidence that I had never had to be able to deal with conflict. And basically, I got in the therapy room and I was like, this is where I've been supposed to be this whole time.
Mm.
But I never would have chosen to go there.
Did you get bachelor's and master's at Abilene Christian?
That's correct.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep. I
Wow.
did Bachelor of Arts in Youth and Family Ministry, and then the it's an MMFT, Masters of Marriage and Family Therapy, and that's the in Marriage and Family Therapy we have COAMFTA accreditation, which is kind of like the equivalent of CACREP. It's like the
Mm.
top, and if you have an MMFT, that means you went to a COAMFTA accredited
And what
school.
what year was that you got the master's?
So I was it's a 2-year program, and I started in 2008, and I graduated in 2010 from that program.
So, something I've noticed, and I don't know what your experience is going to be like. It might be different coming from like an Abilene Christian compared to like a bigger state school. But something I've noticed is in the past 5, 7 years or so, a lot of these type of master's level programs have been heavy on the social justice indoctrination. But people who came through 10 or more years ago didn't see a lot of that. And I'm wondering if you saw any kind of political bias in grad school.
So this is a really good question. I was thinking a lot about this question. I watched your interview with my friend Soad
I love
the
her.
other day because I was kind of like, okay, I want to see, how the conversation flow goes. And I've known her for a few years, probably 4 or 5 years now. She's an awesome person. Shout out to Soad.
Yeah.
Um, so we get back on track. Where was I at? I got distracted by talking about my friend.
Political bias in grad school.
Yes. Yeah. So I was surprised to hear her describe her experience and then just kind of comparing it with my own because hers sounded like was pretty absent of leftist concepts, intersectionality or critical race theory, or whatever the terminology is that we want to assign to that. When I went through in 2008, it was very different than the type of discussion that was going on around those things, like what I experienced. So I had, professors who we would do a class, so it was like our treatment models class, the first one that we did. And in that class, we were learning, let me think, cognitive behavioral therapy, structural family therapy, strategic family therapy, and internal family systems. Those were the four models we were learning. We would cover a treatment model, and at the end of every unit, where we studied, cognitive behavioral therapy, the professor would then go, okay, so now we're going to do a feminist critique of this model.
This is Abilene Christian. Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
this
Okay.
was in 2008.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Now, I feel like that professor was not like she was not pushing, she was not at least very strongly pushing somebody to adhere to that ideology, but she viewed that ideology as valuable. And so we would use it at the end of a unit. So, it would be like, okay, so what kind of problems would this model potentially pose to somebody from Hispanic background or from who is a woman if it was a model that was created by a man? And it would be kind of very small, you know, piece of discussion at the end of a discussion of a treatment model. So the other thing that I think was kind of more honest about that than what maybe is done now is she was very honest about, okay, this is coming from intersectionality.
Mm.
And, in the intersectional view of things, we see that there's been a history of certain groups having power and other groups having less power. And so she said, no, this is not a treatment model. It's not equivalent to a treatment model, what we're doing here. It's a separate theory that we're using to critique the models. And
Mm.
so that was a little bit more compartmentalized than I think what is done in some places today, where I think a lot of professors, a lot of students coming out of those programs they are not even aware that intersectionality or critical theory is not a therapeutic theory, that it's not equal to, it's an entirely different discipline, it's an entirely different
Yeah.
subfield that has kind of gotten plugged in, inserted itself into therapy where it was not there before in that way.
It's like you almost don't need to name it because it's just kind of overwhelmingly obvious common sense. It's kind of how it's presented. Yeah. I'm wondering, something I see in my grad program is there's kind of, when I look at professors, there's a split between like the true believers who are willing to fight you for social justice and people who it's like, we're covering feminism today because that's what's in the syllabus. We just kind of go along with it. Did you see that kind of divide?
In school, yeah, I think I would say I did to some degree. Think through a couple of examples of that. Yeah, I had a different professor who was very, I think, much more devoted to the ideology and much more kind of already under the assumption that, she never said this, but the way that she would react to questions was very potent, I guess, and kind of forceful. So, some of the things that occurred to me when we were sitting in those therapy model classes, we talk about how important it is to have cross-cultural validation of treatment models, and so, well, CBT is, cross-culturally validated. Solution focused at that time was cross-culturally validated. I mean, even all the way back then. And so I'm thinking about this and I'm like, okay, you're telling me it's cross-culturally validated, but then you're asking me the question, how is this going to hit somebody from one of these subgroups wrong? And I'm like, well, how is it going to hit somebody from a subgroup wrong, in general, if it's a cross-culturally validated model? Well, I made the mistake of asking that in class one day of this other professor. And she did everything short of call me a racist in the classroom. She got visibly angry. She talked about how important it was to, to be gentle with the experiences of people who are different than my own. Then
Did they
another
ever?
time,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, oh, you go ahead.
Did any of your professors ever bring up the fact that you're a white man as a way to delegitimize what you're saying?
The professors did not, not in my recollection. Other students did, and the professor just kind of let that go, like just kind of let it be. Uh, there wasn't there wasn't acknowledgement that that was a power move in the discussion. So you would, I didn't get dogpiled super bad in grad school. We had a really, really close cohort, and everybody in my cohort knew me and knew that I was kind of a nice, really nice, quiet guy.
Yeah.
And so they knew that I did not dislike them. I did not look down on them in any way. So I didn't get treated too badly there, but I did get shut down a couple of times.
There seems to be like this mentality within the social justice mindset that if you were to say, I think CBT is a good modality across populations, someone could say you're a white man, and from within that logic, that is a complete argument.
Yeah.
Against your position. You don't have to lay out any kind of evidence. The fact that you're a white man is its own reason why you're wrong.
Yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. Exactly. And it's so funny. One of my close friends in grad school, we had this term that we came up with, and we called it, like, doing marital therapy. Like, every once in a while, one of the spouses or partners would pull out the God gun. That was our joking term about it. But it was kind of we're in a pretty deep, church environment where it's kind of Bible beltish. And so we'd be doing couples therapy sometimes, and somebody would go, we observed a session one time where one of the partners said, if you really love me, I think you would do what Jesus says you should do for me, which is do the dishes and take out the trash before I say anything to you. That's the God gun. It's like, okay, I have this kind of MacGuffin phrase that will just automatically eject your position, your priorities from the relationship and put mine right in the middle. And
It's the trump
I don't see
card.
any difference there.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think part of the reason that's interesting is because within Christianity, the God card is the highest card you can play, right? Whether you're playing it fairly or not. And in the same way with social justice, the identity card, is the trump card. Like, I called you a white man. I said you're privileged. That, nothing beats the ace of spades, basically.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, earlier I was just about to launch into another time that I got in trouble with the one professor that was a little bit more serious about the social justice ideas. We were talking about, it was in, I think, an assessment class, and she said something and it made me curious. I don't even remember what she said, but what it caused me to ask was, hey, as far as bias goes, if I'm doing good client-centered therapy, and I am letting the client direct the process as much as possible, which is something that all of those professors would say we should do. Isn't it true that I'm going to avoid a lot of potential missteps that are related to someone's, ethnic background, racial background, cultural history? Because I'm never assuming that I fully understand what that client is saying. And I'm always approaching it from a sense of curiosity and not quite understanding, so that I'm always inviting the client to further articulate the landscape of their own world, probably in a way that they never have. And that's part of, an effective therapy process. And she did not like that.
No.
She got mad because she was talking about, what I think she was talking about was like the importance of, kind of that feminist critique, but of assessments.
Mm.
And and how you do, we were doing formal and semi-formal assessment, and she got angry at me again. And similar kind of thing, like, we can't minimize the experiences of people who are oppressed and suffering, and just kind of shut me down. And I was like, I didn't think that question was offensive.
Mm.
I thought it was a reasonable question, and I really did. I was not, I wasn't being that kid, rocking the boat in
Yeah.
class that day. I was just like, these are two ideas that don't make sense to me. And those moments were really when I was already kind of skeptical about the feminist critique, because I had done that therapy models class before. And then, now I'm getting these inappropriately strong emotional reactions to a stimulus from an adult who's I'm supposed to be sitting at the feet of and learning from. And I'm like, this is incongruent. I don't I don't feel like this is what I should be getting from this person in response to this question. And so that kind of inoculated me, I guess, a little bit. And I kind of from then on viewed those ideas as kind of, okay, I'm not sure about what these are. I don't feel really comfortable.
It's fascinating to me what I would get pushback on and what I would not get pushback on. Something that I would view, like you're saying, is completely innocuous and just, you know, like I would, like in a multicultural class, I would consistently say, like, we should treat people like individuals and have a spirit of open minded curiosity. And that was like not the appropriate view to have. You're supposed to make assumptions about people. I remember, especially with racial minorities, you're supposed to assume that basically their primary issue is structural racism that they're facing. And if they don't believe that that's their primary issue, and this is straight out of my textbook, like a quote from my textbook from Daryl Wing Sue, they're suffering from Uncle Tom syndrome. Like, this is what and I'm just like, how is this good therapy? It's just so baffling.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh, that I don't want to get on the topic of Daryl Wing Sue, because
Could go down a rabbit hole.
I may rant for several hours. I've heard him speak at Evolution of Psychotherapy. I've been to that conference a couple of times. It's a great conference. I recommend people try to go at least once, because you have like Richard Schwartz, and like the year that I went in person, it was Richard Schwartz was there. Bessel van der Kolk was there.
Oh, wow.
Sue Johnson, John and Julie Gottman were there.
Oh, wow.
Who else? Like lots of Dan Siegel.
Okay.
I could keep going down the list. I mean, it's like that level people. If you're for a psychoanalyst out there, Otto Kernberg was there. I heard him talk.
Ah,
Salvador Minuchin was supposed to be there that year. And for those of you who aren't marriage and family therapists, he's a really big deal. He's the founder of structural family therapy, a genius, super brilliant guy. He unfortunately passed away earlier that year. Did not get to hear him. I did get to hear Chloe Madanis though, who was a student of the founder of strategic family therapy. Lots of kind of my intellectual forebears were there, which is really, really neat.
very cool.
But I heard it was not that year, but I heard Daryl Wingsu, and oh my gosh, I took so many pictures of slides that I was like, this is incredible racism that you've documented yourself being wrapped up in. I just mind blowing, like how much vitriol toward white European people that he has. I just could not believe it. I kind of couldn't believe he was at that conference, which has traditionally been very much about the kind of the beauty of helping people through the models that were created by these really brilliant people. So that's wild. Okay, so I have a story
Yeah.
I can tell you. It's a quick story, and it'll give you a little bit more of my work background too. So when I finished grad school, I worked for 2 years in community mental health agency, suicide crisis intervention, severe mental illness kind of stuff. And that was a really hard job. After that, I got my license finished. I was moving into private practice, but I was like, I feel like I need a little bit, some steadier income than that to get started. So I took a part-time job as a hospice chaplain. And when I would tell my friends I was doing that, they would go, that sounds awful. And I found that reaction kind of funny coming from therapists, but understandable too, because it's like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine doing that. It was so rewarding. One of my favorite work experiences of my life. The things that I was taught to do in family therapy, that worked well, were like supercharged
Mm,
in that environment, because people don't have self-defense priorities when you're at end of life.
mm.
And so, they just need a little help getting unstuck. And so I saw like incredible reconciliation happen. So thankful to have seen that. But go back. This is about cultural competency. So, we're in Texas. There's lots of Hispanic people from different origins, different national origins. But one of the things I was told when I first started was, hey, a lot of the families around here who are Hispanic, they have this belief that if when their mother family member dies, their spirit leaves their body and it floats around the house and you have to open a window. And if you don't open a window, that's when you end up with, houses getting haunted because the spirit couldn't escape. It gets stuck in the house and it haunts the place. And so, among a lot of those families, a way to honor their loved one is to open the pathway for them to ascend to heaven and be with God, and by opening that window. And so I'm like, okay, this is a cultural accommodation thing I need to be aware of. And I did see some families who were really, who were really appreciative of that, because you would just kind of, you show up to a patient death, and you would be doing some comfort and interventions and trying to get them a healthy kickstart on grief process, and that's when you would plug in some of that cultural accommodation. Well, I remember showing up to this apartment for a patient death one time, and I asked the family, it's a little time had passed, and we had kind of done the initial stuff to check on them and care for them, and then I went and asked the primary caregiver, which I think was a daughter, hey, do we need to open a window? And she's like, open a window? Are you hot? What? Like, no, okay, no. It doesn't sound like that's something that needs to happen. I was just asking, and I had to explain myself. Like, I was just asking because, a lot of people who are Hispanic origin families that we've worked with have this belief. And she was like, no, not at all. She was like very kind of modern Protestant in her faith.
Mm.
And so that was a good lesson, or I already believed this, but that was a really strong reminder for me that, your phenotype, your skin color, appearance is not any guarantee of holding any particular belief. And in my mind, that just reinforced that idea that, okay, me being gently curious and asking people what they believe. So like I could have asked her, is there anything important that we need to do to honor this person, or to make sure that their passing goes the way that you would want it to, or that she would want it to? And that would be a more open-ended question. But I think a lot of times, like, our cultural diversity training is kind of like it's
Mm.
it's kind of like, what does the bulk of this group tend to prioritize? But that doesn't solve your problem,
Yeah.
because you still have, variety and outliers within those groups. At the end of the day, you still have put all the cultural diversity training on it you want. You still have to be client-centered and curious
Mm.
to navigate those kind of situations.
Yeah.
I really believe that, and and that kind of ties to ideas of more related to like classical liberalism. And I can believe what I choose to believe based on on spiritual priorities, or based on my own life history, learning history, and I don't have to be in a category.
You brought up religion a few times, Christianity. So you're a practicing Christian. You went to a Christian university. I don't see necessarily like an open, overt demonization of Christianity, but I feel like there's somewhat of a mentality in the field where it's like this is kind of a backwards belief system, and ideally the client would outgrow that and evolve beyond it. Do you see any of that?
Not a tremendous amount, not in my area, because where I live, because it is so very kind of deep Bible Belt.
Mm.
I think, I'd say a bigger concern that I have is people that I never would have expected to become um, wrapped up in like intersectional thinking,
Mm.
um, are in many cases the exact ones that ended up being wrapped up in that. And I see it making its way into church,
Mm.
even here. Here it's like it's individuals, have kind of gotten wrapped up in it and bought into it. And an interesting thing I've noticed about that is it is people who were very, very conservative, and you might even say legalistic in the way they approached faith. Like they want rigidity and rules and firmness to things. And what I've seen happen in the church throughout my life is kind of more and more relaxation, and more of rules, and more welcome, and more true acceptance of people. And that's uncomfortable if you're somebody who wants like things to be segmented and sectioned off and rigid. And that's how I've come to understand that. It's like the kids that I grew up with, I say kids, like the people that I grew up with who are my age, the ones who've gone hardest that direction seem to be the ones who were kind of the most churchy, at least in some cases when we were growing up.
That's really interesting. I think part of that is the desire to adhere to some rules, which, you have clearly laid out rules. Another part, I'm wondering if you notice, we're talking about two populations here that I think might be uniquely vulnerable to being hijacked by empathy, and that's therapists and Christians, right? Therapy, like your primary objective, the primary trait that you have to have is empathy. And with Christianity, Christ tells us to basically love aggressively, like fiercely love our neighbor. And it's so easy to sneak in there. It's like, well, if you really want to fight racism, then you'll fight it with more racism. If you really want to fight misogyny, then you'll be devoted to hating men. If you really want to help out gender confused kids, then you'll support their chemical and surgical castration. And it's like this empathy is just warped into this very perverse place. I'm wondering if you kind of see that in those two populations.
Say more, those two populations, what do you mean by that?
So
Oh, church and
Christians and therapists.
gotcha. Definitely, yes. I mean, and kind of in the general public view of that for sure. And I think it is that pull to be, accommodating. We got to be as accommodating and accepting of the person as possible. And probably a little bit less in church where I am. Although if you look at, it's interesting, if you look at the churches in the town where I live, the most progressive ones, like the ones that had events for Black Lives Matter during 2020, are the ones where the theology professors attend. And to me that was not surprising because most of them are like Yale educated, or Duke Divinity educated, and so they're coming from these ivory towers of theological academia, which are also far left institutions. So I see it making its way in there, and definitely in therapy. So to another thing that I did to kind of get ready for today, I have interacted with Katie Kernodle a lot on X, and I like her a lot. She's a very fun person.
She's phenomenal.
I disagree with her on a couple of things, not
Yeah.
not, powerfully, like we're always really friendly. And, but one of the things that she has said, and she and I have talked to, and y'all mentioned it when you interviewed her, this idea that, that client-centered I think she may be right about this, or I think let me start with the concession part of that. I think she may be right that there is an opening that is made for that kind of suicidal empathy idea
Mm.
to make its way in. If you're fully devoted to client-centered therapy in a humanistic view, if that makes sense. Now, it's she kind of opened my eyes to some of like Carl Rogers' lying assumptions, in humanism. Now, an interesting thing for me is that I really believe in doing client-centered therapy, but I'm not a humanist. And I think it has to be possible to be that because I exist, but not very many therapists, I'm learning, not very many therapists view it the way that I do, where I give you a brief just kind of summary of how I see things. So I think God created everything. I think that everything got distorted in Genesis 3 at the fall of man, whenever events like that happened in history. And the distortion that happened there is what has resulted in things like illness, suffering, mental disorder. It's created opportunity for all that to exist. Now, I think God has put a lot in place to make us ready to be in full relationship with Him. And that's been His plan the entire time. And so a part of that is we have capabilities for healing that are built into us that are part of His own image that are built in. So when I'm doing therapy with somebody, I am not healing them.
Mm.
That's it's almost idolatry of self in my mind to say that. I am not the healer. I am somebody who is connecting them with something that pre-existed in wherever it lives in their body, in their nervous system, in their brain, to just kickstart that thing. And maybe you might call it like a antivirus software, or you might call it like a little engine or machine whose job is to heal. I didn't build that. And I'm just participating in this plan that God has to restore everything to full relationship with Himself, which means, no suffering, no illness, no disorder. And that I talked with Katie about it, and I think that's some of what inoculated me again to not drift all the way into that because I look at some things, I'm like, okay, some things are distortion.
Mm.
Some things in the world are twisted from what they were originally intended to be. And it is okay. It's not okay that things are twisted. It is something that I accept as like the natural course of existence
Yeah.
right now. But a lot of therapists, Christian therapists who I have interacted with, including people in my cohort, they don't connect those two things that way.
Mm.
And they kind of see it as, okay, so it kind of is that humanist person-centered view overrides the possibility that, okay, there can be wrong, there can be disorder. We don't have to treat every behavior as if it is ideal.
Mm.
It may be functional and still broken.
Mm.
It may be functional and meeting a short-term need, but with a huge long-term cost for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. In some ways, I see kind of your humanistic and Carl Rogers type mentality is antithetical to the social justice approach, because in some sense, you're letting the client guide their own journey. Whereas in the social justice approach, you need to kind of put a thumb on the scale a little bit. Maybe we need to look at your privilege today, or maybe we need to talk about how you're systemically and structurally oppressed. You're kind of guiding them towards your political views, whereas like in a true humanistic view, you're kind of letting them choose the journey.
Yes, I completely agree with that. That's why I think there's something to be saved there.
Mm.
One thing I'm concerned about is a lot of therapists that I talk to who are conservative, and a lot of influencers are online. Ooh, I'll drift into education here a little bit too. Are I think we stand to lose a whole lot, and that may include some of those treatment models that are very, very powerful and helpful that have alleviated a lot of suffering for people. And what I mean by we stand to lose a lot is like if our fields remain devoted to gender theory and surgical procedures that don't alleviate suicidality, we will experience public backlash over that. We saw in the 1980s asylums were completely done away with, and I'm not advocating for asylums in general with this statement, but what I'm pointing out there is we had a treatment system there that was intended to meet a need. Parts of it strayed far from meeting that need, and then we lost it due to public backlash. I don't want to see people suffer because our field is totally stripped of all credibility because of my association as a therapist with others who are therapists who want to, allow kids to have hormone treatments. I'm truly concerned about that. And I see some therapists saying, oh, we should throw out this model. We should throw out that model because the model creator has become really, really far leftist. And I'm like, well, but when they created that model, that was not a part of it. And so I'm worried about that. I don't want to see us lose avenues for healing people, for alleviating depression, for alleviating PTSD. On the education side of that, there's a huge pushback against social emotional learning. I think that one's trickier because a lot of times the people who are handed the social emotional learning, they haven't been like reading, James Lindsay and Jonathan Haidt books for the last 10 years. They don't, they can't look at a set of material and go, okay, this part is from cognitive behavioral therapy, but this part, no, that part is from intersectionality, and those are separate ideas. So I think that's where you see some indoctrination happening in schools that is maybe, I don't want to say unintentional on the part of people who are delivering the material. Now, we should call that out when we see it for sure and not allow that to happen. However, that is if we're talking about therapy and problems with critical social justice being in therapy, we're talking about SEL. It's the SEL isn't the bad guy in my opinion. The therapy isn't the bad guy in my opinion. The bad guy is the distortion that has occurred. And we don't treat other fields this way either. Journalism is all but totally captured.
Mm.
And I don't hear people saying, oh, we should do away with journalism.
Yeah.
But people are saying, all therapists are bad because the field is infiltrated. I don't like that. And it's not any different in education. I train educators all the time in my job. Man, and I'll give you an example. One, we've gotten to tour some schools that have some, I probably shouldn't say the name of the SEL model because I don't want to draw positive or negative attention. But what I will say is it's a very widely recognized, like kind of well-known model for doing social emotional support of students. And you walk into school and the students are leading all, you're touring, right? And the students are leading all the activities. So they're like taking you on a tour of the school, and they are explaining what all the bulletin boards in the hallways mean, and they are describing what they're explaining to you what they're learning as far as how to do healthy conflict with their peers. They are charting their own progress academically, and they can tell you where they are and what their next steps are at all times. So I'm like, there are amazing positive examples of students becoming more emotionally differentiated. And I'm using the term from Murray Bowen from in multi-generational family therapy there. They're emotionally differentiated. They have skills that allow them to pursue healthy interdependence with peers, with adults. And I don't want us to lose that. Another thing about SEL in schools that I see is, man, we are not living in a time where we have just, intact families left and right who are providing a solid emotional foundation for their students before they're being sent to school. We also have, all the mental health implications that are going on with smartphones and educational technology that are making things harder for teachers and administrators. And so to remove all training that could be helpful for those teachers and those administrators to be able to navigate, just to teach their kids healthy conflict. If we ban SEL in schools, we may see a situation where teachers are we can't teach kids how to engage in healthy conflict with one another, and just take that kind of Lenore Skenazy let grow mentality of, okay, we're going to let them resolve their own conflict, and as long as it doesn't escalate to unhealthy levels, we're going to let them negotiate it, and we're going to let them, it's going to be their responsibility. That's their emotional domain to solve, and we're going to let them solve it. That's what's going to produce emotional health in kids. And I think we should just do, now this is easier said than done. I think we should do whatever leads toward that. Now, when you get in the ideas of kind of like critical social justice and whatnot, then you get those power levers getting put in there about, okay, well, you have one student who's from, a minority group, and you have one student who's white. What's going to happen in that? Oppression has to win when those rules are at play. But that is not healthy interdependence. That is intentional power imbalance. And there can be power imbalance isn't evil. Golly, I probably will get canceled for saying that. That's probably like the most antithetical to critical social justice thing I've ever said. Power imbalance is not evil. Scripture doesn't treat it as evil. It's part of the order of the world. What's important is how we communicate and treat each other in spite of the order. And so, anyway, I don't know if I brought that all together into kind of a neat bow, but
No,
those
that
hit
was
some.
brilliant.
Those are ideas that I think are really important.
Yeah, I agree. I want to switch gears a little bit. You briefly brought up kind of the child gender transition, and I'm wondering what you're seeing in the field, because it seems like, almost overnight, it was like, with virtually zero evidence, it just became common sense, best practices. Gender confused children use gender affirming care. You push them into this medical transition, and it almost seems like this mass hysteria that just overtook our field. I'm wondering what you're seeing in that regard.
I would say that I saw very much, well, I think back to your conversation with Soad. I met her because in 2020, I was on a Facebook group for therapists, and an individual had posted this advertisement for the purpose of which was, okay, come to my CEU session and I will teach you how to write a gender affirming care letter for someone who is seeking surgical intervention after only one session. And we should do that. We should write a letter for somebody to receive the surgery after only one session, because to not do that would be gatekeeping. We should not gatekeep. It's unethical to gatekeep people and keep them from doing what they know better to do for themselves. Now, I found this thread, and then I found somebody. I was like, I cannot believe this is being said. So this was in 2020. I can't believe this is being said. This is so antithetical to everything that I was taught in grad school for any traditional therapy ethics. Like, you'll have people request that you write a letter for them to be able to keep an animal at their apartment. Well, what I was told in grad school was, You don't write a letter after a single session for anything. That's unethical. It's kind of a pro quo kind of weird thing to do. You don't know the background of the person. You don't know the history of why they might need that or might not need that. You don't have a chance to discuss with them, okay, is it possible that, can live in your apartment with your anxiety and not have an animal there? Because I would want my client to be able to have an animal. I would also want my client to be able to survive in that apartment without it, whatever pet we're talking about. So, bring it back to that discussion forum day. I found somebody who said exactly what I was thinking, and that person was getting dogpiled hardcore by dozens of people, calling her a bigot, calling her an oppressor. You're allied with the oppressors. You're not looking at this individual's needs. And so I jumped in to try to help that person and go, no, I agree with you. It's not. And then of course they turned on me. And then I got a private message later in the day or the next day from somebody that I had never talked to before, and they were like, "Hey, can you tell me a little bit about what you believe?" And I did, and it was somebody who was an admin for the therapist group that So had talked about when she was here, and so I ended up joining that group of people, which is how I met her and many other awesome people. They're amazing, and so that became kind of a little haven for a lot of us to sort of get better at advocacy for what we believe. And I think a lot of us have gotten so a lot of the stuff that I put out on X, sometimes it comes from that group. It's stuff that other people have found in that group, or we kind of work out some arguments there, kind of get better at thinking through those ideas and being ready to respond to people. And one thing that has impressed itself upon me there is people I've got to be able to put out there, I'm a conservative and a therapist, and I own guns and I shoot guns for fun and I hunt deer, and those are things that therapists aren't supposed to do.
There's so much there that I've heard, basically from what you just said, I have heard that you should not be a therapist because you are a hateful person, you are a bigot, you have no empathy, you're siding with the Nazis. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say, nope. And unless a client, directly asked me, well, and I wouldn't talk about politics anyway. So that's something that's kind of interesting. Like, and that's something that's true of virtually every conservative therapist I'm at, is we won't talk about politics in our sessions because that's what we were trained to do, is not talk about that. But, people would ask about, hobbies and things like that, and they would only know about those hobbies if they asked. Because I had a few things around my office that were kind of like, rustic or kind of like hunting oriented, and I would tell them, yeah, like I go and do this for fun. I go and do that for fun. I take my boys on hunting trips and things like that. But, what I would say to that is that personal beliefs do not, in any research that has ever been done that I'm aware of, have implications for the treatment outcome. That if I am doing appropriate therapy, the treatment outcome will be effective. It will be a product of me doing the most right thing I can as the therapist, moment by moment, and the client's motivation. And then of course underneath all that is the connection I'm able to have with the client. I don't know if you know. Let me throw in a plug for a researcher that I really like. His name is Scott D. Miller. I found him at Evolution of Psychotherapy. But he's a family therapy guy, which was kind of neat to discover. He's done tons of research um, on therapy outcomes. So I don't know if you've ever seen the graph where 15% of positive therapeutic outcomes are attributable to hope. 30% is the largest chunk of that graph, and 30% is the
Therapeutic.
therapeutic relationship. He was part of the creation of that graph.
Wow. Okay.
He's done more research since then and has found that the only therapist-controlled factor that matters for treatment outcome is the therapist's ability to connect to a wide array of life experiences.
That brings up something very interesting to me that I have noticed in my experience. And as a former lefty, I'm not just pointing fingers at others. I used to be a radical socialist, so I'm in some way pointing the finger at myself as well. But I was talking to Stephanie Wynn. I think you might know her.
Yes, interacted with her a bunch. She's great.
Yeah, she's great. She said, the multicultural competencies she said she never had were for dealing with conservatives and Christians. And, this is kind of the general attitude in my program, but with so many other therapists that I've interacted with, it's like this idea that conservatives, especially Trump supporters, are just icky. Like you wouldn't want that in your office, like to get that conservatism on your couch. You know what I mean? Like that, it might stick and you can't,
Yes.
you can't
Someone
Febreze that
else,
away.
someone else might sit in it. It might get on
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so that, um, so I know I've heard you reference, like you've read Coddling of the American Mind, right? So, Jonathan, have you read The Righteous Mind?
Oh yeah, love it, love it.
Okay. So here's an interesting discussion point for us. You know how he talked about the moral foundations theory in the book and how libertarians and conservatives are very good at looking at leftists and assigning the moral motivation to a leftist's behavior that they themselves would also assign. Like I can look at why somebody voted for Joe Biden and I can explain like this is what they believe and here's a moral explanation. However, even back then, I think that book was written in 2012? And even
Yeah.
back then, he'd said leftists are not, his research revealed leftists are not good at, they cannot assign a moral motivation. But then he assigned a very factual but somewhat compassionate explanation to that. They're only using 2 out of those 6 moral foundations to assess moral behavior. Those are the only memory card slots they have for what constitutes moral actions. When everything was happening in 2020 and we had all the masking come out, related to COVID, I said to myself at that time, I think people on the left are now using sanctity versus degradation.
Ooh, that is can you flesh that out? That's a phenomenal point you just made.
So in the book, he talks about, he did all this research in a variety of cultures. And, so he researched people in India, in Africa, in inner cities, in America. And, what he found is that a lot of individuals or families who are from places that are considered conservative or that are considered kind of more primitive culturally or technologically speaking. Traditional, exactly. They really emphasize sanctity versus degradation, which is clean versus unclean. So when you were talking about that, like kind of on the couch and that ick, it's kind of like, I think that's a sanctity versus degradation attitude. And so I'd be, I don't know if Haidt is still researching that or if the group that's running moralfoundations.org is still studying that, but I'd be willing to bet some money that we saw a dramatic shift in 2020 and that COVID-19 was the catalyst for that to shift into a sanctity versus degradation view. But it's kind of like you're clean if you hold this belief and this belief and that belief, so, and if you're a white man, you're clean if you are willing to accept responsibility for all the racial injustice that's ever been perpetrated.
Yeah.
Because of the color of your skin or because of your sex.
It's, I would kind of compare it like in a sense to Christianity in the sense that, I don't know if you know James 2:10 in the Bible. It says, "He who keeps the whole law yet stumbles in one point is guilty of all." If I, at one point in my life, said, I don't know if you can choose your gender, that makes me transphobic, which also makes me a white supremacist, which also makes me a misogynist and fatphobic and ableist. You know what I mean?
Yes.
The difference between wokeness and Christianity is the whole point of that verse in James is to point you towards a savior. But in social justice, there is no Messiah coming to redeem you.
No, there is not. So I love the track that we're on right now because it's stuff that I've thought about a whole lot. I grew up in Churches of Christ, which were a movement that started in the late like concurrent to the founding fathers of the U.S. So a lot of the stuff they write sounds like a lot of the stuff that they write that say like George Washington or Ben Franklin wrote. They were very much in that era. They started out as Presbyterian ministers, and they had this thing in the Presbyterian church at the time called the mourner's bench. And it was kind of something that came out of predestination, where predestination was a really popular doctrine at the time, and everything is already decided and kind of laid out. And I might be saved, I might not. So, what can I do? Well, I can take my coin that I'm going to put in the offering plate, and I can go sit in the mourner's bench, and I can beg to God that I'm one of the elect, but I might not be.
Mm.
That's unchangeable conditions. There's not a mechanism for redemption in that. And so there's kind of a famous story about this founder of the Churches of Christ who one day he was thinking to himself, I believe that there's opportunity for redemption and transformation, and that is part of Scripture. And he had his coin. So what you would do is you would pray on the mourner's bench, and you would take your coin and drop it in the offering. That day, he took his coin and he set it on the armrest of the pew, and he walked out, and he never went back to that church or that doctrine of predestination. He went on to found our church movement from there, because he was like, we can't live this way. Well, so it's kind of like critical theory didn't invent anything new with this idea of, perpetual guilt. Church has been there and done that. And, so I put those beliefs together in myself, and I'm like, I'm not about to go back to a hopeless future. It's a hopeless future. And when I've interacted with people who are on the left online who are therapists, one thing I always try to ask if I have the opportunity is, okay, can you explain to me where is the change mechanism? Where's the positive behavior change mechanism in intersectionality or in gender theory for me?
Mm.
If you say I'm oppressive and you say I'm a bigot, what is my avenue for transformation and behavior change? And the
Mm.
answer is perpetual guilt.
Yeah, there's in fact even the concept of solution, like searching out solutions, is somehow problematic. Like you need to always and only be focused on the problem.
Yep. Which I was trained in solution focused brief therapy and narrative therapy, which are very, very similar in that if you're going to achieve change, you have to focus on what is functional. And that's another question that I've asked some of those folks online is, okay, is there any part of me that is not racist? And can you acknowledge that that's functional, or that would play some kind of role in a behavioral change mechanism for me to be able to repair relationship with people who I have allegedly oppressed? And there's never an answer to that. It which those are things that I have always seen about these approaches to therapy that make them philosophically opposed to the ideology. And it's one of the things that to me is like so mind-blowing that so many therapists have drifted to that. They don't see the philosophical opposition of those things.
I want to switch gears for a minute. You are a man in the mental health field, which makes you a minority, a very female-dominated field. Men are not doing so well with mental health right now. We're dropping out of the labor force, dropping out of education. Mental health is worse. Suicides are up. Addiction is up. Overdose. A lot of the men that I'm seeing, their free time is consumed with either playing video games or watching pornography. Men are struggling right now. What can you say to men as a mental health expert?
That is a great question. So I will say for myself, you're not supposed to self-disclose a lot as a therapist, but this is something that I would self-disclose to male clients sometimes. But then I would kind of put some more meaning behind it. So the two biggest things for me that have made a difference in confidence, in feeling purpose as a man, were becoming a therapist and having a that was powerful. I could exert to do something visible and positive in the world around me. So that's where I kind of bring it back to some deeper meaning. I'm not telling, somebody that they should go become a therapist. But what I'm saying is I think you should find a skill that is something that is productive, that produces a visible benefit or a benefit that we can make more tangible by reflecting on it, that lets you know, okay, I'm making some imprint in the world. So if you look at mental health outcomes for men, some of the worst mental health outcomes belong to stay-at-home dads. I
Wow.
don't know if you have seen that
Why do
before.
you think that is?
I think it's because, if you believe in kind of like epigenetics and adaptation, which I do, I don't think those are incongruent with faith as I understand it, because God can build whatever he wants to build, and he can build it to work however he wants it to work. I think that's how he's built us to work. Men haven't done that for any of human history. Like up until, well, if you read Love Sense by Sue Johnson, up until 1964 in America, we were single income households. Men worked, women took care of houses. And I view that as adaptation. It's human specialization. It's incredibly adaptive. It's not pathological. But feminism came along and maybe didn't pathologize it at first, but has pathologized it. And so, like, men, I think, derive purpose from, I go kill meat. I think that's where we have to be. Uh, Another thing that has been a really big deal for me. So when I finished grad school, I could not find a job for about a year and a half. This was in 2010, so it was kind of right after economic stuff happened. That was pretty bad. Licensed people were leaving private practice and going to agencies. So it took me a while, and I was going insane because I felt confident for the first time in my life, and I didn't have anywhere to put it. No one
Mm.
would hire me to do the thing that I knew good and well I could do, and that I was excited to do for the first time in my life. And so I did some good solution focused thinking on myself, and I said, okay, man, this is my world. What's within my world that I can control right now? I can control being in a healthier lifestyle. I started working out. I hadn't worked out regularly ever, other than high school sports. I swam, but I hadn't since then. I weighed probably 250 pounds, 260 pounds when I finished grad school. I'm 6 feet tall, for reference. So I was no muscle, pretty chunky. So I started working out, and then I started tracking my food, and then I started doing harder workouts, and then I started lifting heavy weight. And I view all that as kind of like a practice of mastering my body, and that being a productive, tangible benefit in the world around me that I can see. Okay, if I had a really, really, really hard day, I can go put some heavy circles onto a metal bar and lift that. And nobody can take that away from me. No situation can take that away from me, what I've achieved there. So I think mastering your body in some way, that doesn't mean you have to go deadlift 400 pounds, but man, I think there's some neuroscience evidence to this too, that becoming confident in the movements of your body bestows emotional confidence. And so those are two things that I would say really that we really need to see happen.
Yeah, I love all that. I suffered from severe chronic depression for many years, and something about exercise is just like magic for mental health. And especially, I don't know what it is about being a man, but I feel like something about lifting heavy things just it's like the idea that if someone was in distress and needed a box picked up, like I could do it.
Yep.
I don't know what that is, but it gives you this sense of like I could do something, I could lift something heavy if I needed to. And for some reason as a man, that gives you just such a feeling of competence and purpose, and I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Knowing, and related to that, tied to that, knowing I at least have a better chance of being able to protect my family or
Mm,
protect myself, but especially my family. Myself matters much less, than being able to be a protection to them.
yeah.
And that's not the reason I worked out. That's secondary for that, but it is something that's true, I think.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Okay, I got two questions left. One is, how do we fix the therapy profession?
So I think some good things are already happening. Some people say we need to just kind of, like we got to kind of wipe it out, and I was talking about my concern about that earlier. What I actually see happening is we have somewhat of a parallel economy, I think, that's emerging. And I think Soad has talked about this to some degree in some of her posts, but she's got her conservativecounselors.com, and I would definitely throw a plug in for that. I'll tell you, I'm not listed on there because I'm not practicing. I didn't want to confuse anybody, but if I were practicing, I would go and list myself immediately. In this agency work that I'm doing, there's not really room for that right now. But that's an example of a kind of a parallel economy of, hey, we're out here. This is the work that we're doing. If this is the kind of treatment that you are seeking, a traditional psychotherapy ideology-free approach, then we come to us for that. I think that's what is going to take care of it. And I don't want to see us in a total schism of, you have almost these entirely different environments of conservative therapists over here and progressive or leftist therapists over there. I don't think that's not healthy ultimately. But what I hope to see happen is enough groundswell in those parallel economies. You have I know several people who are involved in the Association for Mental Health Professionals. They're on X and they're on Facebook, and they have a conference every year here in Texas that is centered around kind of traditional. It's conservatives are a part of it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It's people who want ideology out of therapy, and I'd say the people involved in an NAMHP are conservative, and they would say that very loudly. But those organizations emerge because because we don't have a place in our own institutions, in our own professional organizations. I left AAMFT in 2018 because every keynote but one was about me being an awful white man. That's what it felt like. I felt like I was being preached at, and I was the evil person in the room. And I filled out a scathing evaluation and said, "You'll not see me again until you publicly reverse direction and go back to your ideological roots of general systems theory. This is not systems theory. This is not what the field was created to be."
You know, I hate the idea of going to this era where it's like you pick a therapist based on how both of you voted. You know, that just seems really perverse to me. But at the same time, you know, I feel like the therapy profession not even is catering to liberals, but like the maybe 5% of most left leaning people, like ultra far. And it's like 95% of people are not being appropriately represented, at least by how the therapy profession is officially with our ACA, APA type organizations, how we train therapists, you know. And I almost would think like if I was going to see someone who announced themselves as a conservative therapist, even if I wasn't a conservative, it's like, well, maybe I can just get regular CBT instead of talking about how Donald Trump is an existential threat. You know what I mean?
Yes, that seems reasonable. That seems like a reasonable treatment goal kind of request, I feel like, from a client. Which, and that's one thing I appreciate so much about the conservativecounselors.com is it's very forward about, we have our beliefs. We're not going to inflict those on you. That's not what therapy is for. And it's very honest and direct about that. And I love that. It's like, if I say I love that, I feel as you do about that. I don't want us to be in an era where that would even be considered as necessary. But I think that is a beautiful threading of a needle to be able to say, hey, here's where we're coming from. We're going to be honest about it, and here's what you're going to get from us. No more, no less. And that's a very American attitude about business, I think.
I like that.
And it's not unethical, I think, as long as you're not proselytizing people. That's what ethics have always said.
Yeah, I agree with that. Final question, and this is in terms of looking at society more broadly, but what is one thing that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
So I knew that I knew that I suspected that question was coming because I've watched a few of your episodes, and I thought about this, and I was like, I'm going to mention a couple, and then I'll talk about one. Do I want to talk about the fact that big tech companies want your kids using AI right now? So that's something I've seen coming through education technology, and I've got a few tweets out there about that, and that's concerning because we know how much smartphones impacted kids. That's not the one. That's not the one I'll talk about, though. Do I have a third one? I don't think so. So here's one that I've talked about some out there on social media as well. We are at a point where people talk about constitutional crisis, right? We are at a point, I think, where we are in a constitutional crisis, but it's not the ones that the representatives on either side are talking about. In a country where you have a constitution, but legal representation is totally unaffordable to me or any average, like, working class person in America, do we actually have constitutional rights? That, to me, is scarier than anything that's going on in therapy. And I've put thought into kind of like some of this stuff around legal practice since grad school. We had to observe family court sessions as part of my ethics and law class, and that was a great experience, super eye-opening. Court is a conflict amplifying machine. It worsens interaction categorically across the board. And then if you're talking about cases of family court, then it claims to make decisions in the best interests of the child. Well, how can you tell me that you did things in the best interest of the child when you did everything wrong and against the best interest of the child up to the point at which you rendered that decision, and then the decision is somehow in the best interest of the child? So, arguments are conflict amplification algorithms. And guess who's running our country? Lawyers. So this is I don't think we're going to fix the rot in our culture long term and for good. And also, where did critical social justice first make its way into professions?
Law schools.
Law school. Interesting, right? So this is probably the biggest thing that I could say as an answer to that question. We need some serious legal reform. Like, not the law itself, but the philosophy and the ethics around which, like, how are we making our arguments in court?
Mm.
And what is ethical for us to charge the average person? Like, and I don't know how to do it without it coming from within, and I'm not in that. So,
What that reminds me of, I'm not sure you're familiar with Hannah Arendt.
no, I'm not.
She wrote this book called Eichmann in Jerusalem about this Nazi official who's being tried for war crimes. And she goes into it expecting he's like this monster, but he's really just a paper pusher. And she coins this term, the banality of evil. And you think
I'm
of,
familiar with the term.
yeah. You think of like, okay, how's this country being run, for good or for ill? Okay, the president and then Congress, and then Supreme Court. And what you're talking about is the way the country is run, like effectively on a day-to-day level, is by lawyers in courtrooms,
That is our actual structural oppression.
Wow.
And it's not race oppression, and it's not gender, sex oppression. Profession oppression? I don't know.
Well,
I almost don't want to play that word game, but that's how it feels.
Well, Jonathan, this is a fascinating conversation. If you'll hang out just a minute until the upload finishes, love to have this conversation again.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me. I loved it.